with that being said, we're going to move on to the next segment. I'll be sharing my list of UFC fights that I would like to see in the calendar year 2025. So realistically, guys and gals, I could really sit here all day long and talk about so many fights that I would like to see in 2025 in the UFC. But I have a few big fights that I do believe is possible for 2025. These are some of the fights that I would love to see for the calendar year 2025 in the UFC. So starting off with fight number one, it's Alexander Volkanovski taking on Diego Lopez. I would really love to see this fight in the beginning part of 2025, as early as UFC 312 in Sydney, Australia, and Alexander Volkanovski's backyard of Sydney, Australia. Now, realistically, I would rather see Alexander Volkanovski versus Diego Lopez. I'd rather see that fight more than an Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria rematch. I wouldn't mind seeing that rematch down the line 2025, but I think Alexander Volkanovski needs a big test before he gets back in that octagon against Ilia Topuria. And I think Ilia Topuria would tear him up and knock him out even worse than the first fight if Alexander Volkanovski doesn't test himself before getting in the ring with the king of the featherweight division first. So I think this would be a fun number one contenders fight between Alexander Volkanovski and Diego Lopez. I think that's what the UFC should go for. It would be a really interesting fight because you have the veteran guy, Alexander Volkanovski, who held that featherweight title for 4 to 5 years, a dominant champion, one of the greatest featherweight champions of all time. But then you have a hungry, young, up-and-coming star in Diego Lopez, who's been climbing up the featherweight rankings and passed his first big test against Brian Ortega a few months ago in the UFC. So I think that's a big fight. That's the fight to be made, as Ilia Topuria possibly recovers after fighting Max Holloway UFC 308. I think that's the fight that the UFC should try to make for 312 instead of rushing Alexander Volkanovski and an Ilia Topuria rematch at this particular time. So, next fight on my list, and I'm sorry, but for this middleweight division, Sean Strickland, get out the way. I need to see Dricus Du Plessis versus Khamzat Chimaev in 2025, in the early part of 2025. Now, after Khamzat Chimaev dominated Robert Whittaker at UFC 308 in under 5 minutes, we're talking about Robert Whittaker, one of the greatest middleweights of all time, former middleweight champion. Khamzat Chimaev dominated him in under 5 minutes. That's more deserving to be first in line for a middleweight title opportunity than what Sean Strickland did to Paulo Costa. I'm sorry, that dominant performance just that smells money to me, and that I would label him as the number one contender right now. I mean, he already moved completely up in the middleweight division. He's currently the number 3 ranked contender right now. I'm sorry, I just think that's a more better fight than what Dricus Du Plessis and Sean Strickland could give us. And I know how good the first fight was, a very close fight in the beginning of part 2024. But man, could you just imagine Khamzat Chimaev and Dricus Du Plessis in there for that middleweight title? Both are really good grapplers. Both can mix it up standing, striking wise. I know Dana White, what he just thinks of that matchup is just money. I think they just got to go in that route. I wouldn't be mad at it, but hey, let's just say if Dricus Du Plessis and Sean Strickland, that's the fight we see first, and Dricus Du Plessis gets past Sean Strickland again, line it up for some point in 2025. That's a fight I definitely need to see between Dricus Du Plessis and Khamzat Chimaev. That's a money fight. But next fight, and this fight would take place at the lightweight division. It's Islam Makhachev versus Arman Tsarukyan. Obviously, this should be Islam Makhachev's next title defense at the lightweight division. Yeah, you can move up to become a welterweight champion one day, but you still got some title defenses to do at lightweight, Islam Makhachev. And I'm gonna get into that in a few moments, but I think Arman Tsarukyan should be next in line for the lightweight title. He did everything that he was supposed to do. He defeated Charles Oliveira on the UFC 300 undercard. He did that earlier this year, but the thing that hurt him was while he was making that entrance to fight Charles Oliveira at UFC 300, he got into an altercation with a fan. You cannot do that. And Arman Tsarukyan paid the price for it because he was suspended and put on the sidelines for a while by the UFC and Dana White and the executives. Plus, I think this lightweight title fight makes a lot of sense because as great as Islam Makhachev is, And I know he's had 3 successful title defenses as the lightweight champion. But as great as he is, and in my opinion, he's number 1 right now in pound for pound list. But the thing is about his lightweight title reign, he defeated Alexander Volkanovski twice. Yes, correct. But Volk was a featherweight. He was an up-and-coming guy going up to be great to fight for that lightweight title. Let's not forget that. So realistically, Islam Makhachev has only defended the title against one true lightweight, against one top 5 contender, that being Dustin Poirier when he defeated him earlier this year by submission. I just think that Islam Makhachev, don't let him move up yet. Let me see this lightweight title contention, lightweight championship fight between Islam Makhachev and Arman Tsarukyan. Now, obviously, for those that have been following both these guys' career for a very long time, Islam Makhachev did defeat Arman Tsarukyan years ago. But that was a very long time ago, and both fighters have improved tremendously since then. So I think this is the first fight, the first championship fight that should be made for 2025. Should be Islam Makhachev versus Arman Tsarukyan for that lightweight title. Now, next fight, I think this fight makes a lot of sense. Give me Dustin Poirier versus Justin Gaethje in the trilogy fight, and this should be Dustin Poirier's final fight in the UFC. Now, we see Dustin Poirier say it on record, if he's not fighting for a championship, he really doesn't have any business being in the UFC much longer. And he did, unfortunately, lose to Islam Makhachev earlier this year. So the perfect fight for Dustin Poirier to have in 2025 to end his career, I think it's this against Justin Gaethje. That would be a perfect trilogy with both guys beating each other. It's 1-1. It's 1-1 apiece. You had Dustin Poirier knock out Justin Gaethje in 2018, getting a 4th round knockout victory. Then last year in summertime 2023, Justin Gaethje knocked out Dustin Poirier in the 2nd round. So once again, we're tied 1-1. I think that's a perfect fight for both guys that are out of title contention at the lightweight division. Both really don't have much time left in the UFC. Why not give us this trilogy? And I think that's a perfect way for Dustin Poirier, win or lose, to exit from the UFC, having a trilogy fight against Justin Gaethje. What we all know how powerful these guys are, landing strikes, to be fireworks all over the octagon. And that could easily headline a UFC pay-per-view, being in a co-main event slot or a main event slot for some point in 2025. I think that's a good fight for Dustin Poirier to end his career against Justin Gaethje. Now, last but not least, this one's unlikely, but I would like to see Alex Pereira versus Jon Jones. And give me that at heavyweight with Alex Pereira daring himself to be great. Now, like I said, this is very unlikely to happen because Jon Jones will most likely retire in the next few weeks, win or lose against Stipe in the main event of UFC 309 when the UFC goes to New York City and Madison Square Garden. But, hey, a guy can dream. I think that would be a fun fight between Alex Pereira and Jon Jones. Alex Pereira and Jon Jones, or however you have your pound-for-pound list in the MMA inside the UFC world, both have to be in your top 3 right now because of how dominant each of these guys have been in their UFC careers. And this would be a good story with Alex Pereira trying to move up the heavyweight, fighting the greatest of all time in Jon Jones, daring to be great, daring to be a 3-division world champion, possibly becoming the first ever 3-division world champion in UFC history. If Alex Pereira could just tap into being a decent grappler and work on his grappling skills, because he's really only known as a striker, hot take, but I think that's a 50-50 fight. If Alex Pereira could just get some type of decent grappling game going, because you know Jon Jones will eat him up on the mats and on the ground right now. But if he could get that going, I think that would be a 50-50 fight. And I think that would be a fun, entertaining fight with Jon Jones and Alex Pereira, 2 top 3 pound-for-pound stars mixing up in the octagon. That's a money fight. But I think that's very unlikely because I think Jon Jones is ready to end his career on his own terms. And I think win or lose at UFC 309, he is going to retire against Stipe. But man can only dream. I think these fights that I just presented to you guys would be some big marquee fights for 2025 in the UFC. We'll see how many of these fights Dana White and the UFC executives make out of the list, out of my dream list, that actually comes to real life and reality for 2025 in the UFC.